Chapter 15. Saturday. Doreen got up the next morning bright and early, put on her gloves while the coffee dripped, and headed out to the backyard. It was thankfully empty. Which she couldn't say about her front yard, still filled with people. She had no idea how long the police had stayed last night. Neither did she care. They had a job to do and would do it, regardless of the length of time it took. But they didn't seem to be here right now. She just hoped her appointment with Mac wouldn't be affected by all this. With the wheelbarrow in hand, she burned through her restless energy, still hanging on after a bad night. She moved the cut-up wire around to the front, ignoring the crowd. She hadn't heard from Mac, and still had no idea if he would be on time or a little bit later this morning, or if he'd come at all, given yesterday's events. She wanted to get some work done on her own garden before she headed to his mom's. She was excited at the idea, mostly because she needed the money, but also to see how this could work as a career direction. If she got in a few hours today, then she hoped that Mac might pay her today. Having overspent her grocery budget yesterday, she had to find a way to replenish that money. No income coming in sucked. Half an hour later, she walked inside through the back door into the kitchen, snagged a cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for the sweat to evaporate off her back and face. She had moved all the wire to the front yard. Thankfully, with her last load, Doreen noted how the nosy neighbors had left. Was that Mac's doing? Regardless, now she had 2 stacks of refuse for the dump on her driveway, one of wire and the other of rotten wood. She still had all the metal poles to move. But her efforts had made a massive difference already, as the backyard looked quite decent. By rights, the entire backyard should be scraped clean to the dirt, underground irrigation put in, topsoil put down, then she could plant her garden. If she added decent nutrition-based fertilizer, she'd have a thriving backyard. She didn't think Nan's place had any irrigation anywhere, and that was a problem. Doreen should look around, see if she could get second-hand soaker hoses to weave through the beds. As she finished her second cup of coffee, her phone rang. Willie's number appeared on her screen. "Hi, Willie." "Hi, are you there right now?" "I'm heading up to the lake country in a little bit. I was going to run by and hook that stove up for you on the way. If that would work, I've got the breaker with me." "That would be great. I have an appointment at 9, she said, adding a little self-importance to her tone. "It takes about 10 minutes to get there, but if you could come now, and it doesn't take you very long, that would be perfect." "Okay. Me and my son will see you in about 10 minutes, he said, then hung up. She pocketed her cell phone, put down her empty cup, and walked outside again. The wheelbarrow wouldn't work so well for the poles. She'd carry them one by one. She was dragging the last 2 large ones from the backyard to the front when Willie pulled up. He hopped out, his son too, and took a look at all the old broken-down fencing material and said, "Wow, that's a lot of junk." "Isn't it though?" She smiled up at him. "Now, if only I had a decent way to get rid of it all before the neighbors start to complain about the mess." "Dump run," Willie said in a sing-song voice. "I end up doing those on a regular basis. Once I take that old stove away, it will have to go somewhere." She gazed at him with a crafty look. "So what would it take to have you haul all this with it?" He frowned. "I don't have my dump run vehicle today. Didn't think to bring it to haul away your old stove." He glanced at his panel van and back at her. "If you don't mind me leaving the gas stove right here beside the rest of your fencing stuff, tomorrow I can load it all up and take it to the dump. You don't have very much here. If I put the other appliances I have to haul out on the flatbed truck first, we should be good to go." Her face lit up with joy. "If you could do that, that would be awesome." "Thank you." Mac had said he might be able to haul some away too. So maybe, between the 2 men, she'd get rid of it all. He nodded. "It's really a pain to have stuff like this hanging around. The wood will be full of bugs. He motioned at her small car. You don't want to put wire and rotten wood with nails into a vehicle like that. She nodded. I noticed the bugs. He nodded agreeably, motioned for his son to follow him, and headed inside. He had a couple boxes in his hands, which she presumed were breakers or something. She walked around to the backyard and made sure it was all picked up, loaded another wheelbarrow full of little bits and pieces, took it to the front, dumped it on the tarp, and then took the wheelbarrow back around again. As she walked into the kitchen, she checked the clock. Almost 8:30. She needed to leave soon. Willie had just wiggled the new stove into position. Standing upright, he said, "It turns on and looks good." And the gas lines have been capped off properly? She asked. She couldn't help but remember Mac's comment about the gas dangers. Willie nodded. You're safe and secure. This is properly wired up. You'll have to put some money into the house wiring at some point, but it was done right originally. Only the codes have changed in the last 50 years. So, whenever you renovate, be prepared for the fact that the electrical bill will be a little higher than you had planned. He put the old stove on what he called a hand truck, and with his son's help, moved it to the pile in the front driveway. She watched as her stack of trash grew bigger. You sure you can come and get this tomorrow? She couldn't imagine what all the neighbors would say if she had a junkyard like this around long. Her ex-husband would have had a fit. He would have the man back within the hour to get it all gone. But then her ex hated disorder of any kind. No problem, Willie said with a big smile. With that, the two men hopped into the van and drove away. She looked at her watch, walked into the kitchen, and washed her hands. Then she grabbed some yogurt and granola that she had gotten on her last grocery trip for a quick breakfast today. With that polished off way too fast, she could almost hear her ex-husband's admonishing voice about proper manners as she placed the bowl in the sink, ran some water in it, grabbed her gloves, and walked out the kitchen door. No way she wouldn't walk to Mac's mom's house. It was only a couple cul-de-sacs over. And she could take the creek path. Provided the police hadn't crossed the area off with yellow tape. Although she didn't think that was possible, since it was Mother Nature's space. Surely they couldn't block it all off. She called for Muggs, who came racing and barking toward her, as Goliath strolled into view. Thaddeus took up his position on her shoulder, and she realized the entire family would go to work with her. Goliath led the way. She went around the corner of her property and stopped. Mac was there with two policemen. She frowned up at him. He grinned. I was just going to your mom's house, she said. He nodded. I'll walk with you. He gave a couple more instructions to the two officers, then turned and led the way. When they were out of earshot, she asked, Are you here to stop me from digging in the creek? He tossed her a surprised look. No. Of course not. I left men here this morning working, so no way would they have let you do that. Oh. She didn't dare admit she had planned to at least look at the area to see if anything had surfaced overnight. His smirk said he knew exactly what she was thinking. The morning was beautiful, and she'd already gotten some work done. Although she'd forgotten to pay Willie. Willie was here this morning. He hooked up the stove. But he didn't ask for the money. Mac looked at her in surprise. He might send you an invoice. Does he have your email address? She thought about that. I don't know. He'll probably request an e-transfer. Her heart stopped. An e-transfer? She sighed. Just give it to me straight. What do I have to do? He led her through the process of sending money online to Willie through the banks. I didn't even know that was possible. What if I don't have the money in the account? How were you planning on paying him? She shrugged. Cash. But I have to pay Barry too somehow for the electrical work he did. Call Willie to see when he'll be in the area next, or you could drop it off at the office. He's coming back tomorrow because he didn't bring his big truck to take away the old stove. Plus he has a bunch of other stuff to haul to the dump, and he said he would take the fencing I had piled out front too. That's very generous of him. It is. I've got it all stacked up in the driveway so he can easily load it. Did you already get everything moved to the front yard? He asked in astonishment. She nodded. I've been working on it since yesterday. The five of them walked toward the cul-de-sac where Mac's mother lived, down the path to the road, where it widened into a big circle. What a sight they must have made. His mom's place was in the middle. They headed into the backyard, and Doreen took a good look at the begonia bed again. This bed has definitely suffered. Because we don't know why, you should boost the nutrients in it. She glanced around at the hilly beds, watching as her brood checked out this backyard with curiosity. If you don't want to bring in any new topsoil, you could quite probably steal enough from some of these beds. He looked at the beds. But that'll disturb all the plants there, right? She nodded. Yes, and I don't really know what bulbs she's got buried in there. Once you start digging around, you'll damage the roots. I can bring the pickup by with a load of topsoil, he said. It's not that big a deal. She smiled. It isn't for you. For somebody like me, with no truck and no muscle, it is. He laughed. I think you have more muscle than you know. You moved all that fencing material. She smiled. I did, didn't I? Do you have a tarp? I can start laying out the begonias and getting them moved over. It's early in the season, but, because they aren't doing much here, we'll trim the old roots back to the tuber and put them in their new bed. They won't do much this year, but they'll be very thankful for it next year. Next year. Next year. Next year. Doreen smiled at the bird, shaking her head. She never knew just what he would say, just what he would pick up. Together she and Mac walked to the large garden shed. Mac pulled out a spade for her and a shovel for him. Next he found a big tarp, and they spread it down beside the begonias. Instantly Goliath appeared mid-jump and landed on the tarp, loving the sound it made. After Doreen's heart started beating again, she enjoyed watching her huge cat play with his tail, like he was a kitten again. Mug sat nearby, staring. He probably thought Goliath was strange too. Never a dull moment, Mac said. Doreen wondered if he was talking only about her pets, or was she thrown into the mix too. As she stared at the spot where they had dug into the begonias the first time here, she said, "You never did tell me about that bone." What bone? She motioned at the begonia bed. The one we found here. Did I say it was a bone? You did. He shrugged and went back to work. Or have you not found out yet? The lab should be able to tell almost immediately if it's human or not. I've been a little busy. I haven't checked on the results. He dug in the bed where they would move the begonias. Goliath and Muggs helped by digging their own holes. I don't think the animals can dig deep enough to do any harm to the begonias. Then she nodded. Maybe you should call the lab. He shooed away the animals before stabbing the shovel into the dirt beside her, and asked, why? She glanced up at him and shrugged. Because what if it's human? We just found an arm and a hand near my place. What if that was a toe bone or a foot bone here at your mom's? He stared at her in astonishment. So because we found an arm in the creek, you think my mother's garden bed will have a foot? With shock and laughter in his voice, he said, better get back to the gardening job. Leave the police work to me. Okay, fine. So it's a little far-fetched. But you have to admit, it is interesting. What's interesting? He wasn't giving an inch, but he had stopped to pet Goliath and Muggs. They were eating up the attention. Apparently Thaddeus got jealous and waddled over. Mac stroked the bird's head, murmuring something to him. Think about it, Doreen said to Mac. What are the odds we'd find another human bone? Considering it's you. He let his voice trail off. At this point, the animals decided it was time to run wild in this backyard. She snorted and carefully picked up another large group of begonia bulbs. The bulbs themselves looked healthy, but the roots were small, stunted. She laid them carefully on the tarp, though Goliath seemed intent on rearranging them, but gently, so she kept on working. She looked at the bed. Do you think I'll always see a 6-foot-long garden bed and think a body is buried in it? He laughed. I wouldn't be at all surprised. Doreen watched as her trio suspiciously calmed down, lying together near the garden. She frowned, wondered what was up. Any updates on the ring, by the way? He was back to shoveling. No, none. Just then, the kitchen door opened, and Mac's mother walked out. Considering Mac's size, his mother was tiny. She probably didn't even reach 4 feet 10. Doreen waved. Good morning. I'm Doreen and I'm here with Mac, she said by way of explanation. The woman stared at her in surprise, then shifted to see Mac walking toward her. She didn't seem to mind the strange animals in her yard. Or maybe she hadn't seen them yet. Good morning, Mom. How are you feeling? The frail-looking older woman had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. But she gave him a bright smile. I'm feeling much better, thank you. She turned to Doreen again. You're the body lady. Doreen's jaw dropped. I'm who? She'd half expected to get some kind of a nickname, but wasn't at all sure she liked this one. Mac turned to his mother. Mom, this is Doreen. She's the gardening lady, he said with firm emphasis. His mother chuckled. That's what you call her. She smiled at Doreen. I'm glad you like gardening. Considering the amount of bodies you're finding, I'd have thought it might have turned you off the hobby. Doreen gave her a bright smile back. The fact is, it's made me more intrigued. She motioned at the garden around her. You've spent a lot of time and love on this garden. Mac's mother nodded. Call me Millicent. And yes, I have indeed. It was a shared hobby with my husband. It makes me sad that I can't come outside and do the same work anymore. I understand. I'm now living in Nan's house. And of course, it was the same thing for her. I have my work cut out to get her gardens back to the glory days they were. Oh my, you're Nan's granddaughter. Millicent clasped her hands together in delight. Doreen looked at her and sighed. I gather you know my grandmother? Millicent laughed. Of course I do. Everybody knows Nan. That's what Doreen had been afraid of. Now the real question was that a good thing or a bad thing? Mac patted his mother's shoulder and said, Mom, why don't you go inside where it's warm? She waved him off. It's lovely out here. But you haven't been feeling well, have you? We don't want you to catch cold. She looked at him and smiled. I know you're trying to keep me safe, but it's really lovely out here. And I do love gardening. Doreen understood. It would be hard for her too. It had always been hard for her to let others do the gardening she wanted to do. Well, maybe if you had a hot drink and you sat in the sun close by, you could watch us, she suggested. Millicent ignored Mac's look. That's a lovely idea. I'll make a pot of tea, and then I'll come out. Doreen smiled and returned to her digging, as Millicent hurried back inside. Doreen heard her animals getting frisky again, but didn't dare look up, because Doreen was intent on ignoring Mac too, even though he loomed over her. You really didn't need to invite her out here, you know. The reason we're here doing the work is so she doesn't. If she sits and watches, she'll feel like she's more in control and not like we're taking over her garden, Doreen said quietly. A garden becomes a living thing. She's attached to it. Her memories from years past are here. To have someone else doing things in her garden without her knowing about it will be very painful and intrusive, like it's no longer her garden. She sensed his surprise. She turned to look up at him. Letting her sit here surely can't be harmful, can it? She's not allowed to get her hands dirty, he warned. Doreen nodded. Fine. She pulled up another big pile of begonia roots, but she felt something hard underneath. I'm surprised rocks are in here. This bed's been established for a long time. Maybe that's why the bed isn't doing very well, he said. Although I don't see any rocks. It's all dirt. She stuck her spade back underneath and hit something solid. She turned to look at him. Really? You're making me paranoid these days. He stooped beside her. I don't think we're paranoid. Just wary. He rolled his eyes and helped to remove the loose soil. The animals, again curious, huddled together with them. Depending on the climate, begonias were usually removed every winter. But these bushes hadn't been pulled out in decades. So they had a massive connected root system. Moving gently, Doreen and Mac cleared a spot a good foot long. I'm surprised so many bulbs are here, Mac noted. Another reason why the tubers need to be divided and moved, she said. When they're growing in on top of each other like this, the bed gets too crowded, and the plants have to fight for nutrients. He got the bigger shovel, and using his heavy boot, he pushed the shovel into the area where she had hit something hard. He hit the same thing. He lifted the shovel so he could brush some of the dirt off the top of whatever it was. Within minutes, he had a larger area opened up, and Doreen scrambled to pull out the begonias as he loosened the dirt. Typical male. Everything done fast but without too much care. She had removed a pile of rocks too. Why the devil would rocks be in here and dirt thrown on top? She frowned. They seem to cover this section here. Like a small cairn. Don't say that word, he said in an ominous tone. She frowned. Cairn. 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 Cairn, Thaddeus added. Yeah. They're created by heaping rocks over bodies to keep animals from getting at them. Doreen looked at the relatively small pile and laughed. If it's a body, it's a cat or small dog. And either way, the rocks must be removed before we can put any plants back in here. He brought over the wheelbarrow and removed the rocks. Goliath jumped in the hole for all the good he did. Each rock was a good 6 to 8 inches across. Then Muggs jumped in. She lifted both of them out, gave Mac a hand removing the rocks, then froze at the sight of a wooden box. Did your mom ever have cats? He shook his head. No, she's allergic to them. By the size of this box, a pet is probably buried here. With the rocks gone, he loosened one portion of the long box, but the end was all rotted and shifted. When he lifted the box, all the wood fell away, leaving something inside the hole. She dropped to her knees as the air sucked out of her chest. She tried to find oxygen, but it just wasn't there. She sat back on her heels and gasped like a fish. A hand slapped her on the back. Breathe, Mac ordered. She took a great big gulp of fresh air and nodded. I'm fine, she gasped. I'm fine. Good for you, Mac said morosely. Because I sure as hell am not. The dog, the cat, and the bird stood at the edge of the hole. Together, the humans and the animals stared at the item in the box. It was close to 2 feet in length, maybe a hair smaller. And what Doreen could see appeared to be bones, foot bones. Are you sure you don't want to check with the lab now to make sure that the bone we found the other day wasn't human? He groaned. And only 1 foot is here. That means we're still missing the other one. She pointed to the bones. It's missing several bones, especially the big toe. He nodded. At that moment, she turned to look at Muggs sitting nearby with a big grin on his face and something small and white between his front paws. Don't look now, but it looks like Muggs found it,